The telegram was still in Raymond Walden's coat pocket when he stood on the platform of the Coldwater Creek station, and the woman stepping off the afternoon train was not the woman he had been promised. He knew it the moment she lifted her eyes to his. There was something in those pale green eyes, the color of creek water in early spring, that did not match the careful, composed description he had received in the letters. The letters had spoken of a steady woman, a practical woman, a woman who had run a dry goods store in Missouri for 3 years without complaint. These eyes were not steady. They were terrified. They were searching his face with the desperate calculation of someone who expected to be caught, and the guilt written across her features was so raw and so honest that Raymond Walden, a man who had survived the open range and 2 cattle wars and the particular loneliness of the New Mexico territory, felt his chest tighten with something he could not immediately name. "Clara Holt," he said, because that was the name on the telegram. She flinched. It was small, barely perceptible, but he saw it. He saw everything on this flat, sun-baked land. He had learned to read the land the same way he now found himself reading her, and what he read made the name feel like a lie the moment it left his mouth. "Yes," she said. "That is yes." And her voice broke on the second yes just slightly, and she pressed her lips together and lifted her chin and looked at him with a kind of furious, frightened dignity that sent the blood rushing to his hands. He reached out and took her single bag. It was light. Too light for a woman who had packed everything she owned to travel to a new territory and marry a stranger. "The buckboard is this way," he said. She followed him. And in the 20 steps between the platform and the wagon, he turned the name over in his mind, Clara Holt, and felt, with the particular instinct of a man who had been lied to before and survived it, that this woman was carrying a secret that was already costing her something enormous. He would not ask. Not yet. He would wait, because in this territory you learned very quickly that what people chose to reveal told you more than anything you could drag out of them by force. And this woman, whoever she truly was, had a story she was not ready to tell. What he did not know, as he helped her into the buckboard and clicked the horses forward into the long amber afternoon, was that before the week was finished, she would tell him everything. And before the week was out, he would give her something no man had ever offered her, the chance to be loved by her true name. Her true name was Opal Beckett. She had been riding for 11 hours with that name locked behind her teeth, carrying her cousin Clara's name like a stolen coat she had no right to wear. The telegram folded in her dress pocket, the one Raymond Walden had sent to Clara's address in Hannibal, Missouri, had been addressed to Clara Holt, confirmed bride-to-be of Raymond Walden of Coldwater Creek, New Mexico Territory, arrival expected Wednesday the 14th of September, 1882. Clara had read that telegram on a Tuesday morning and then had set it down on the kitchen table and told Opal, very quietly, that she could not do it. She could not marry a man she had never met in a territory she had never seen, and she was sorry she had agreed to the correspondence at all, and she hoped Opal would forgive her for the trouble she had caused, and she was going to go stay with her sister in St. Louis and try to forget this whole arrangement had ever happened. The trouble was that Opal had read all 12 of the letters Raymond Walden had written to Clara. Not because she was snooping. She had not been snooping. Clara had read them aloud to her, evening after evening, across the small supper table in the house they shared after Opal's own situation had collapsed. And in those 12 letters, written in a hand that was plain and clean, and without any attempt at ornament, Opal had heard something she had not heard in a long time. She had heard a man who was honest. He had written about the land with a spare, fierce love that Opal recognized, because she had felt the same love for the Illinois bottomland she had grown up on before everything changed. He had written about the cattle operation he was building with a clarity that showed he understood both the promise and the hardship of it. He had written about loneliness, not with self-pity, but with the matter-of-fact candor of a man who had made his accounting and found one column wanting. He wanted a partner. He wanted someone to build something with. He was 31 years old and he had 40 acres of decent range, and a house that was not finished on the north side, and he needed help, and he was not ashamed to say so. Opal had sat across from Clara on that Tuesday morning and watched her cousin set down the telegram and felt something rise in her chest that was half terror and half a wild, unreasonable hope. She had her own reasons for needing to leave Missouri. Reasons that wore a man's face. A man named Gordon Phelps who had made promises and then made different promises to a woman in Jefferson City, and had left Opal standing in a church vestibule with a borrowed dress, and a humiliation so thorough she could still feel the shape of it, months later, like a bruise that would not finish healing. She had no money of her own to speak of. The dry goods store had been Gordon's, in the end. Everything had been Gordon's in the end. And she had been living on Clara's charity and working Clara's counter since March. And she was 23 years old, and she was afraid she was going to spend the rest of her life in that kitchen with the same low ceiling and the same view of the same street, and nothing ever changing. So when Clara set down the telegram, Opal had done a thing she would not have believed herself capable of a year ago. She had picked it up. She had read the details of the train ticket that had been purchased in Clara's name. She had looked at her cousin and said, with a steadiness that surprised them both, "Let me go instead." Clara had stared at her. "He is expecting me. He knows my name." "He knows the name on the telegram," Opal had said. "He has never met either of us." "Opal, you cannot simply arrive in New Mexico territory pretending to be someone you are not." "I can get there," Opal had said, and she had heard the desperation under her own words and she had not tried to hide it. "I can get there and then I can explain, and if he sends me back then I will come back, but at least I will have tried to find something that is mine." Clara had looked at her for a long time. And then, because Clara was not a bad person, only a frightened one, she had said, "You must tell him the truth immediately. Promise me that." Opal had promised. She had not kept that promise immediately. She had stepped off the train into the September heat and seen Raymond Walden standing on the platform, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of weathered, unhurried stillness that spoke of a man entirely at home in his own skin. And when he had said Clara Holt with that low, careful voice, she had lost her nerve. She told herself it was only temporary. She told herself she would tell him tonight, or tomorrow morning at the latest. She sat in the buckboard and watched the desert open around her like something vast and indifferent and beautiful, and she made herself breathe, and she told herself she was not a dishonest person, she was only a frightened one, and there was a difference. "How was the journey?" Raymond asked. His voice was the same as his letters, plain and direct, without ornamentation. "Long," she said, and then, because she could not stop herself, "Beautiful, though, when you get past Albuquerque and the land opens up." "I had never seen anything like it." He glanced at her sideways. "Most women find it frightening." "Most women have not spent 3 years behind a counter watching the same 12 faces come through the same door," she said, and then stopped herself, because she had just said something far more personal than Clara would have said, and she pressed her lips together. But Raymond Walden did not look alarmed. He looked, if anything, slightly more attentive. "Fair point," he said, and turned his eyes back to the road. The ranch was another 40 minutes out of town. She watched the land the whole way, the late afternoon light turning the red rock the color of a banked fire, the scrub brush casting long shadows, a hawk tracing slow circles against the pale sky. She could feel the weight of her deception sitting on her chest like a stone, but she could also feel, underneath it, something that was undeniably and inconveniently like excitement. The house appeared around a bend in the dry creek road. It was lower than she had imagined, with thick adobe walls and a covered porch running the full length of the front. He had not been wrong about the north side. The wall there was only half finished, raw brick stacked and waiting, but the rest of it had a solidity to it, a hunkered-down permanence that made something in her settle. "It needs work," he said. "Everything worth having needs work," she said, and she meant it. He looked at her again with that sideways attention. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you where things are." The inside was spare but not grim. There was a parlor and a kitchen with a good iron range and a table large enough for 6, and 2 bedrooms, and she understood without discussion that the arrangement was proper and separate until they had spoken to the minister. He had even gotten fresh curtains in the main room, practical white muslin, still stiff from the bolt, and the gesture was so unself-consciously thoughtful that it struck her somewhere behind the breastbone. "There's a woman in town, Mrs. Abilene Crane, who comes out Fridays to help with the heavy washing," he said, showing her the kitchen. "She's a decent woman. She'll be a friend to you if you let her." A friend. The word landed in her chest with a soft, aching weight. She had not had many of those lately. "Mr. Walden," she started. "Raymond," he said. "Raymond." His name felt different in her mouth than she expected, solid and warm like a stone that had been sitting in the sun. "I need to tell you something. Tonight. After supper, if you will give me the time." He turned to look at her fully then, and she saw that he had known something was coming. The knowledge was in his face, patient and watchful, and he simply said, "All right." She cooked supper because the kitchen felt like neutral ground and she needed something to do with her hands. There were dried beans soaking and a side of salt pork and cornmeal, and she made a simple meal and set it on the table, and they ate across from each other in a quiet that was not entirely uncomfortable. And she watched his hands, large, careful hands with healed cuts along the knuckles and a rope-burn scar on the left wrist. And she thought that these were hands that had done real work, honest work, and she was sitting across from them wearing a lie. When the plates were cleared, he poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down and looked at her without speaking, and she understood that the time had arrived. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the coffee cup and said, "My name is not Clara Holt." The silence that followed was not shocked. It was waiting. "My name is Opal Beckett," she said. "Clara is my cousin. She had the correspondence with you. She had the ticket. And then she lost her nerve and I took her place. I took the ticket and I took her name and I got on the train, and I am sorry for that. I am genuinely sorry. I know it was wrong." Raymond Walden sat across from her and said nothing for a long moment. His face was difficult to read, not cold but contained. She watched him the way she might watch a sky that was deciding whether to storm. "Tell me why," he said finally. It was not what she expected. She had expected anger or dismissal or a cold formality. She had not expected to be asked for her reasons, so she told him. She told him about Gordon Phelps and the vestibule and the borrowed dress and the months of diminishment afterward, the way a humiliation that large could leach out of you slowly and leave you feeling like something hollowed. She told him about living in Clara's kitchen and watching the same street and feeling the months stack up around her like walls. She told him about the letters, his letters, read aloud in the lamplight, and how something in them had sounded like a door left open, and she had been cold and standing outside for so long that she had not been able to stop herself from walking toward it. She did not cry. She had done her crying months ago. She told it plainly, the way he wrote without ornament, and when she finished, she looked up and met his eyes. "You should have told me on the platform," he said. "I know. Or in the telegram. You should have sent your own telegram. I know. Instead you let me call you by your cousin's name for 3 hours. I did." She did not look away. "I was afraid you would not let me off the train." He looked at her for a long time. The lamp between them was burning low and the shadows were gathering in the corners of the room, and outside the window the desert night was making its dark, enormous presence felt. "What do you want to happen now?" he said. It was such a direct question that it startled her into directness. "I want to stay," she said. "I know that is not my right to ask. I know you had an arrangement with my cousin and not with me, and I have no claim on any of it. But if you are willing to start again with my real name, then I would like to stay. I think I could be useful to you. I think I could be more than useful, and I would never lie to you again, Raymond. Not about anything. I am done with borrowed names." He picked up his coffee cup. He drank. He set it down. "Opal Beckett," he said, and the sound of her true name in his mouth, careful and considered as though he were weighing it, learning it, made her close her eyes for just a moment. "Yes," she said. "That is a name that suits you better," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a smile but was close to one. Clara Holt sounded like a woman who organized ledger books. Opal Beckett sounds like a woman who would tell a strange rancher her whole life story over salt pork and cornmeal. She stared at him. Is that a compliment? It is an observation, he said. I am still deciding about the rest. She went to bed that night in the spare bedroom with the muslin curtains and the sound of the desert settling into itself outside. And she lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought that she had done something either very brave or very foolish, and that she would know which before long. In the morning, Raymond was already in the yard when she came out. He had a horse tied to the fence post and was checking the shoe on its near hind foot, and he looked up when she appeared on the porch and said, "Good morning, Opal," in that same careful, learning the weight of it tone, and she felt the name land in her chest like the first warm day after a hard winter. "Good morning," she said. He let go of the hoof and stood up and looked at her with that level, attentive gaze that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he considered important. "I am going to town this morning," he said. "There is business I need to attend to. You are welcome to come or you are welcome to stay." She stayed. She needed the morning. She went through the house with the measured attention of someone taking an honest inventory, not of the property but of herself, her own capabilities, her own determination, the question of whether what she had said at supper about being useful was true or only hopeful. She found the answer in the kitchen, where she organized the pantry and then went out back and found the kitchen garden in a state of productive neglect, with tomatoes going past their peak and dried chili peppers hanging from the vigas, and she picked what could still be used and felt the familiar satisfaction of that, the physical specificity of useful work. She had just come back inside when she heard the buckboard return, and then heard a second set of hoofbeats, and looked out the window to see Raymond arriving alongside a man she did not recognize, older, with a broad hat and a gray beard and the air of someone comfortable taking up exactly as much space as was owed to him. They came onto the porch, and Raymond said, "Opal, this is Harlan Gibbs. He runs the general store in Coldwater Creek. He is also a licensed justice of the peace." Opal looked at Raymond Walden. Raymond Walden looked back at her with an expression that was perfectly calm and perfectly serious and perfectly, she realized, decided. "I had intended to bring you to Reverend Alcott tomorrow," he said, "but I spent the morning thinking and I decided I would rather not wait another day with the situation unclear. If you are still of the same mind as last night, then Mr. Gibbs can perform a civil marriage, and that will settle the matter." She felt her heart move inside her chest in a way that was specific and significant, the way a compass needle swings when it finds true north. "You are certain," she said. "I am not a man who acts on things I am uncertain about," he said. "Raymond," she took a breath. "You understand I am not Clara. You understand I am Opal Beckett, who arrived here wearing her cousin's name and with nothing to offer but honesty after the fact." "That is what I understand," he said. "And honesty after the fact is a better foundation than I have seen in most arrangements. So, are you of the same mind?" She looked at Harlan Gibbs, who had the good grace to be studying his hat. She looked back at Raymond. She thought of the name Clara Holt, which had already begun to feel as ill-fitting as a coat borrowed from someone shorter, and she thought of her own name spoken in this man's level, careful voice, and she said, "Yes, I am of the same mind." The ceremony took 5 minutes on the front porch with the afternoon light coming in long and golden over the red rock, and Harlan Gibbs said the words and Raymond produced a ring plain silver, small and clean, and slid it onto her left hand with a steadiness that spoke of the same character she had heard in the letters. When it was done, Gibbs shook Raymond's hand and gave Opal a brief, appraising look and said, "Well, you've got a steady one there, young lady, by all accounts," and then climbed on his horse and rode back toward town. She and Raymond stood on the porch for a moment after he left, side by side, looking out at the land. "For days," she said. "Pardon. You were expecting Clara Holt to arrive on Wednesday. It is now Saturday." She turned to look at him. "You married Opal Beckett before the week was out." He considered this. "I did," he said, and then slowly, with the air of a man discovering something about his own nature that interested him, "I would do it again." What followed was the particular and fascinating process of two honest people learning to share a life. It was not effortless. Nothing worth anything is effortless, and they were strangers, had been strangers the moment they met, whatever the telegram had promised. There were small collisions of habit and expectation, the inevitable friction of two independent temperaments occupying the same small adobe house in the middle of 40 acres of high desert range. Raymond woke before sunrise and was quiet until mid-morning in a way that had nothing to do with unhappiness and everything to do with the particular shape of his attention, which in the early hours was entirely absorbed by the day's work. Opal was a morning talker, had always been, could not help it, and she learned to hold herself back until the coffee was finished and the horses were checked, learned to read the exact moment when his attention became available to her, and the discipline of that waiting taught her things about her own impatience she had not previously known. She, in turn, kept her accounts in a way that made him initially suspicious, not of dishonesty, but of excess. She wrote everything down in a small ledger she had brought from Missouri: the cost of the cornmeal, the yield from the garden, the mending hours. He came to her on the third day and said, "You do not need to account to me for every," and she looked up at him with those pale green eyes and said, "I know that. I'm accounting to myself. I spent 3 years watching a man tell me that nothing I contributed could be measured, and I find that measuring things myself makes me feel more solid." He had looked at the ledger for a moment and then said, "Fair enough," and never mentioned it again. She sent a letter to Clara the second day after the marriage. It was a careful letter, honest without being punishing, apologetic without being abject. She told her cousin where she was and who she had married and that she was well. She told her that the situation had resolved itself in an unexpected direction, and that she was not in a position to explain everything in detail just yet, but that she was safe, and that she hoped Clara would forgive the further irregularity of the situation. She sealed it and asked Raymond to post it on his next trip to town, and he took it without comment, which she was learning was his way of communicating respect. The week was not only about the two of them discovering each other. The territory had its own demands, constant and unignorable. On Monday, 4 days after her arrival, Raymond came in from the far pasture at midday with news that one of his fences had been cut. He said it quietly, but the tension in his jaw told her this was not a small thing. "Your neighbor?" she asked. He got a cup of water and drank it and said, "Dale Hurst. He has been making noises about the water access on the creek side. I have the title to that stretch. I have had it for 3 years, but Hurst is the kind of man who believes a legal arrangement can be renegotiated through inconvenience. What will you do?" "Go to the land office and get a certified copy of the title," he said. "And then talk to the sheriff." He paused. "It is the 3rd fence this month." She thought about that. "Is he trying to push you off the range?" "He is trying to see how much pushing I will tolerate before I respond in a way that makes me look unreasonable. It is a common strategy." She looked at him. "Do you have any allies, ranchers who share your interest in keeping the boundary lines clear?" He sat down at the table. "Tom Beauchamp, 2 miles east, and the Ray's family at the south end of the creek basin. But Hurst has more money and more men than any of us, and in a territory this young, money and men count for something." "Then you need to make your legal standing impossible to ignore," she said. "You go to the land office, yes, but you should also write to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Santa Fe. Document every incident, date, location, what was found. Build a record that is too specific to dismiss." He looked at her with that full, careful attention. "You know about land records. Gordon Phelps, my former, the man I was to have married, ran a dry goods store, but his family had land claims in Illinois. I kept his correspondence for 2 years. I know what a documented dispute looks like, and I know what an undocumented one looks like, and only one of them wins." Raymond looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up and went to the small writing desk in the corner of the parlor and came back with paper and ink and set them on the table and said, "Tell me what to write." That afternoon, they built a record together, careful, dated, specific, and she watched him write and thought about the strange, crooked path that had led her to this table, this man, this piece of paper that might in some small way help hold a life together. Dale Hurst appeared on the property 2 days later. He arrived without warning, a thick, red-faced man with the comfortable confidence of someone accustomed to his own authority, riding up to the porch on a gray horse with two of his hands behind him. Opal was on the porch when he came, shelling the dried beans she had found hanging in the kitchen, and she set the bowl down and stood up. "Is Walden here?" Hurst said, not acknowledging her existence in any particular way. "He is in the south pasture," she said. "I expect him in an hour. Can I help you, Mr. Hurst?" He looked at her then, a brief, dismissive look that she recognized from Gordon's world, the particular look men gave women they had decided were decorative. "I have business with Walden." "Then I would suggest you wait," she said pleasantly, and picked up her bowl and sat back down. He did not wait well. He sat on his horse and his men sat on their horses, and she shelled beans in the September sun and felt his irritation building like a pressure front, and she did not find it frightening. She found it informative. A man who cannot wait for 20 minutes without visibly stewing is a man who is used to getting everything immediately, and that is a specific kind of weakness. Raymond came up from the south pasture eventually and saw the configuration on his porch, and his face went very still in a way that Opal was learning meant he was paying close attention. He rode in, dismounted, tied his horse, and came up to the porch and only then looked at Hurst. "Dale," he said. "Raymond." Hurst looked at Opal. "I see you've got company." "I have got a wife," Raymond said, with a flatness that was not aggressive but was absolutely clear. Hurst blinked. Whatever he had expected, it was not that. "Since when?" "This past Saturday." Raymond looked at him without elaborating. "What did you need?" "I want to talk about the creek access." "I have nothing new to say about it. The title is recorded and I have a certified copy now from the land office." Hurst leaned forward in his saddle. "Raymond, I have got 300 head that need that water in October when the south tanks go dry. You know that." "I know that. And I am willing to discuss an access agreement that compensates me fairly for the use." "I have never said otherwise." "What I am not willing to do is have my fences cut while that conversation is ongoing, because a man who cuts fences is telling me he has already decided the conversation does not matter." Hurst went red. "You can't prove." "I can prove exactly 3 incidents, each with a date and a location, in a letter that is currently sitting in a posting envelope addressed to the office of the Territorial Land Commissioner in Santa Fe," Opal said, and both men looked at her. She kept her voice even. "I am not saying it was you, Mr. Hurst. I am saying that we have documented the damage carefully, and that any further incidents will be part of that record. An access agreement, on the other hand, would resolve everything cleanly and to the benefit of both parties. I believe my husband is open to that discussion." Raymond was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him, yet not quite surprise, because she was beginning to think that Raymond Walden did not surprise easily, but something warm and specific, the expression of a man who has just seen something that exceeds what he expected. Hurst chewed on the inside of his cheek. He looked at Raymond. He looked at Opal. He said, "I'll think on it," and turned his horse and rode away with his 2 men behind him. When the dust settled, Raymond came up onto the porch and stood beside her and looked out at the road. "The letter is not actually in the post yet," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it will be first thing tomorrow morning." He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was low, and she realized with a kind of startled pleasure was laughter, brief and genuine and entirely unperformed. She felt it all the way through her. The access agreement with Dale Hurst was signed 6 weeks later, after 2 rounds of negotiation that Raymond handled with Opal's notes spread across the kitchen table. It gave Hurst the water access he needed in October and November in exchange for a modest annual payment and his labor on the north side wall of the house, which still needed finishing during the following spring. Raymond had added that last condition himself, and when he told her about it, she had looked at him and said, "You are cleverer than you let on." And he had said, without particular modesty, "I am exactly as clever as I let on. You just assumed I was less." That had been the moment she began to fall in love with him properly. She had been falling in 100 small ways since the morning of the second day, when she had come out to find him in the yard teaching himself to whistle a melody she recognized as a hymn her grandmother had sung, and he had stopped when he saw her and not been embarrassed about it. Or the day he had come in from the range with a kestrel on his glove, young, feather perfect, slightly stunned from a collision with the fence post, and held it carefully while she found an old cloth to wrap it in, and they had sat at the kitchen table for an hour while it recovered, speaking in low voices about nothing in particular, and the warmth of the shared quiet had settled around her like a thing she had not known she was missing. Or the evening she had been standing at the kitchen window after dark when he came to stand beside her, not touching, just standing close, and said, "The coyotes are early tonight," and she had heard the distant singing of them out in the dark and said, "It sounds like homesickness," and he had said, "Most things do if you listen the right way." But love, the real, declaring, unreserved kind, had waited for the day of the negotiation. The day she saw the combination of his patience and his precision and his dry, understated humor and the particular quality of his respect, which was not condescension dressed up as appreciation but the genuine article, freely given, and she thought that this was what she had heard in the letters. She had heard this man all along. She had recognized something in him before she had ever set foot in New Mexico territory, and she had been right. She was sitting in the kitchen one evening in mid-October, the lamp burning against the early dark, when she made herself say what she was thinking. He came in from locking the barn and found her at the table with her hands around a cup of cooling coffee and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and he sat down across from her and said, "Something on your mind?" "Yes," she said. She looked up at him. "I want you to know something. I want to say it plainly without wrapping it in qualifications because I have spent enough of my life qualifying." He waited. He was very good at waiting. "I love you," she said. "I know that we have only been acquainted for 6 weeks, and I know that the acquaintance began in an irregular way, but I have been thinking about it carefully, and I believe the truth of it is not negotiable. I love you. And I wanted you to know." Raymond Walden sat across from her and looked at her for a long, serious moment, and then he said, "I have been waiting for you to say it first because I could not be certain of how you felt and I did not want to put pressure on a situation that was already complicated." She stared at him. "You love me. Since the second morning," he said, "when you came out and caught me whistling and did not make a thing of it." She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the kestrel on his glove and the coyotes at night and the careful, patient way he had been learning her, the way he said her name, which was still the same careful, sun-warmed solidity it had been the first time, only now with months of knowledge layered underneath it. She thought about the ring on her finger that she had not once wished away. And she looked at him across the lamplight and felt something complete itself inside her, like a window latched properly against the wind. "Come here," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, those large, careful hands, the rope-burned scar on the left wrist warm under her fingers, and they sat like that for a while in the good, earned quiet of two people who have found their way to the same place from very different roads. He kissed her for the first time that night. Not tentatively, not with the provisional quality of something that might be taken back, but with the same directness that characterized everything about him, steady and warm and entirely present. And she thought that she had waited 23 years for someone to kiss her like they meant it, like they had decided and were not second-guessing the decision, and the wait had been entirely worth it. November came in cold and clear. The mountains to the north got their first snow on the high ridges, showing white against the blue sky like something clean and declarative. Opal's mornings were full now. The garden was put to bed for winter, but there was preserving to finish, and the ranch accounts, which she had taken over with Raymond's grateful relief, and the ongoing record of the fence repairs and the water agreement. She had also begun corresponding with Tom Beauchamp's wife, Margaret, who turned out to be a woman of formidable practical intelligence and equally formidable loneliness, having arrived from Ohio 3 years ago with 3 children and very little company. Opal rode into town with Raymond on Fridays now. It had started because she needed to visit the general store, but it had become something they both valued, the 2 hours in the buckboard each way, the particular intimacy of side-by-side travel on a long road with nothing to do but talk. They talked about everything. They talked about the range and the cattle and the territorial politics and the letters he had stopped receiving from his brother in Kansas City, who had developed a habit of borrowing money he did not repay. They talked about her father's farm in Illinois and the way the corn smelled after a July rain and whether she missed it, and she said yes, she did, and whether she wanted to go back, and she said no, not for anything. She told him more about Gordon, because he had never asked, and she found that she wanted to tell him, wanted to clear the space between them of anything that was still shadowed. He listened without interrupting and without the particular kind of sympathy that is actually judgment wearing a polite face, and when she finished he said, "He was a fool," simply, with finality, and she felt the last of the bruise release. She told him about her parents, too, her father who had been a quiet man and a good farmer, and had died of a fever when she was 17, leaving her mother to manage a mortgage that proved unmanageable. Her mother had died 2 years after, worn down by the weight of it, and Opal had gone to live with Clara's family in Hannibal, and had been in Hannibal ever since, and the life she had made there had been decent but narrow, and she had felt the narrowness like a physical pressure for years before the telegram arrived. "Do you feel narrow now?" he asked. She looked out at the desert opening around them, the sky impossibly wide, the mountains to the north steady and white-capped and old. She looked at this man beside her, who was solid and honest and dry and had large, careful hands, and who had said, without any particular ceremony, that he had loved her since the second morning. "No," she said, "I feel the opposite of narrow." He reached over without looking at her and covered her hand with his briefly, and then returned his attention to the road. Winter deepened. They moved through the days with the competent, unsentimental grace of people who understand that hard weather is not an emergency but a condition, something you accommodate and work around. Raymond patched the remaining sections of the north wall. Hurst's contribution would come in spring, but he wanted the worst gaps closed before the cold really set in. And Opal learned to bank the fire through the night, and to hang extra blankets over the windows on the coldest evenings. In the first week of December, a letter arrived from Clara. Opal read it at the kitchen table with the afternoon light fading and then held it for a while before saying anything. Raymond came in from the yard and found her sitting with the letter in her hands and said, "News from Missouri." "From Clara," she said. She looked up. "She has forgiven me," she says. "She says she is glad I am well." She paused. "She also says that she heard about the wedding from a friend who knows the Gibbs family. News travels strangely in these territories, and she wants to know if she should be worried about me." "What will you tell her?" "The truth," Opal said. "The whole truth this time." Without qualification, she looked at the letter again. She also says that she has met a schoolteacher in St. Louis named Henry who is reading her poetry. A small smile crossed her face. Clara with a schoolteacher reading her poetry. She used to say she did not see the point of poetry. "People change their mind about things when the right person is involved," Raymond said, and sat down and poured himself a cup of coffee. Opal wrote to Clara that evening, 4 full pages, the most honest letter she had ever written, the full story from the moment she had picked up the telegram to the moment she was sitting at this kitchen table in New Mexico territory, legally married and in love and more at home than she had ever been anywhere. She wrote about Raymond without restraint, because she was done with restraint. She wrote about the kestrel and the coyotes and the access agreement and the way he said her name. She wrote at the end that she was happy, and that the happiness was the truest thing she had ever been able to write in a letter, and she hoped Clara was equally happy in St. Louis, and she hoped the schoolteacher read her very good poetry. She sealed it and set it with the outgoing post and felt, in doing so, the last knot of unfinished business from her old life finally loosen. Abilene Crane, the woman who came Fridays, was exactly as described: decent, practical, and a potential friend if Opal was willing to do her part. She was perhaps 40, with a husband who ran the livery stable and 3 grown sons, and an air of having seen enough of the territory's surprises to be very difficult to shock. She had arrived on Opal's first Friday with the particular wariness of someone who had formed a relationship with the household as it was and was uncertain about the new addition, and Opal had handed her a cup of coffee and said, "I hear you are the person who knows how things actually work around here," and Abilene had relaxed and said, "Well, someone has to." By December they were friends. By January, they were the kind of friends who could sit in the same room without talking, which is a deeper friendship than most people recognize. It was Abilene who told Opal, in late January, that there was talk in town about the new wife at the Walden ranch. Not hostile talk, mostly curious, the particular scrutiny that a small community directs at anyone who arrives in an unusual way. Some people knew, or thought they knew, that there had been an irregularity with the original arrangement. The telegram to Clara Holt was a matter some people had some awareness of, because Harlan Gibbs had a wife with a talent for conversation, and in Coldwater Creek things had a way of circulating. "What are people saying?" Opal asked. Abilene considered her coffee cup. "Most of them say you seem capable, and that Raymond seems settled in a way he was not before. The Beauchamps think highly of you. Some of the older women think the whole arrangement was fast and irregular, but they thought the same about half the marriages in this county, so that does not signify much." She paused. "There are a few who wonder whether you are who you say you are." Opal set down her own cup. "I'm exactly who I say I am. Opal Beckett, married to Raymond Walden." She thought for a moment. "Tell me who is asking." "Gretchen Moss at the boarding house. She had a girl arrive under unusual circumstances years back who turned out to be running from a warrant, and she has had a suspicious eye ever since." Opal thought about that. She thought about what it would cost to go into town and present herself honestly to anyone who had questions, and she thought about what it would cost not to. She had built her life here on the premise that honesty after the fact was better than no honesty at all, and she did not see any reason to revise that premise now. "I will go into town on Friday," she said, "and I will talk to anyone who has questions. My own name, my own account. If people are going to wonder, they might as well wonder with accurate information." Abilene looked at her with an expression of warm, assessing respect. "Raymond is going to be insufferably pleased with you," she said. "He is insufferably pleased with himself already," Opal said. "I see no reason to deny him the additional satisfaction." She went into town on Friday. She went to the general store and to the post office, and she spoke with the people she encountered with the direct, undecorated honesty that had served her in Raymond's kitchen on that first evening. She told the truth about who she was and where she had come from and why she had arrived under her cousin's name, and she told it without apology or excessive self-deprecation. And what she saw in the faces of the people she told it to was, for the most part, the particular respect that people give to someone who looks them in the eye. Mrs. Gretchen Moss she sought out specifically. The boarding house was on the main street, a narrow 2-story building with geraniums in the window boxes dead now for winter, and Gretchen Moss herself was exactly as Abilene had described, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, and the manner of someone who has spent a long time paying close attention to things. Opal sat in the parlor and told the whole story, and Gretchen Moss listened without interrupting, and when it was done she said, "And Walden knew all of this before he married you." "He knew it the night before," Opal said. "I told him Wednesday evening. He arranged for Mr. Gibbs to come out Saturday morning." Gretchen Moss thought about that for a moment. "He is not a man who makes hasty decisions." "No," Opal agreed. So he decided deliberately. As far as I can tell, he decides everything deliberately. Gretchen Moss looked at her with the concentrated attention of a woman taking a final measure of something. Then she said, "My niece in Denver came out west under irregular circumstances too. She spent 2 years hiding the truth of it and it ruined everything. You have chosen a different approach." She paused. I respect that. She stood up and offered her hand. "Welcome to Coldwater Creek, Mrs. Walden." Opal shook her hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Moss." She came back to the buckboard where Raymond was waiting and climbed up, and he looked at her face and said, "Productive morning." "Very," she said. He nodded and shook the reins, and they went home through the January afternoon, and she watched the desert in its winter colors, the pale gold of the dry grass, the dark green of the juniper, the red rock gone almost purple in the thin winter light, and thought that all of this was hers. Not borrowed, not Clara's, not Gordon's. Hers, earned and chosen. Spring came to the territory in the particular way it did, not gradually, but in fits. A warm week followed by a hard, cold snap followed by 2 warm weeks. The desert floor going from tan to green with a suddenness that always startled her. The cattle operation expanded in April with the purchase of 20 more head from the Beauchamp herd. Negotiated over 2 months of Sunday dinners, at which Opal and Margaret Beauchamp formed an alliance of practical intelligence that effectively determined the outcome before the formal negotiations ever began. Tom Beauchamp said to Raymond over coffee one Sunday, "Your wife is a remarkable woman," and Raymond said, without any particular surprise, "I know that," and Tom said, "Did you know it before you married her?" And Raymond said, "I suspected it strongly before and confirmed it shortly after." The north wall was finished in May. Hearst sent 3 of his men and supervised from horseback, and the work was done in a week and a half. And when it was finished, Raymond walked through the completed house, and Opal stood in the north-facing room and put her hand on the newly plastered wall and felt the solidity of it, felt the house as whole, finally, entire, the gaps closed and the cold properly excluded. She had been thinking about that room. She had been thinking about what she wanted it to become. She told Raymond that evening. They were sitting on the porch in the May warmth, watching the last light go off the mountains, and she said, "I want to put a bed in the north room." He looked at her. "We have beds." "A new bed." "A second one." She watched his face. "I think we are going to need a second one." He was very still for a moment, in the way that he was still when something was striking him with real force. Then he turned to look at her fully, and his face had that open, unguarded quality that she had come to recognize as the deepest version of his happiness, the version he did not perform for anyone, that simply existed, that she had somehow been given full access to. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am not certain yet, but I am quite strongly suspecting." He reached over and took her hand, that same gesture, side by side, his large hand covering hers, and held it with a careful, particular warmth. He did not say anything for a while. When he spoke, his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, something younger and less defended. "A bed in the north room," he said. "That is a good plan." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the mountains go dark together, and somewhere out in the desert the coyotes started their nightly singing, and it sounded like joy, she thought. Tonight it sounded like joy. The doctor in Coldwater Creek confirmed her suspicion in June. His name was Dr. Ernest Hoover, and he was a small, bespectacled man of German descent who had come out from Pennsylvania 7 years ago, and had, according to Abilene, missed nothing of Pennsylvania except the beer and occasionally the summers. He confirmed the news with the matter-of-fact precision of a man who had delivered this particular news many times in a territory where it was frequently complicated, and told her to eat well, rest when she could manage it, and come to see him every 6 weeks. Raymond was waiting outside with the buckboard. She came down the doctor's steps, and he looked at her face, and she nodded, and something moved across his features that she thought she might try to remember for the rest of her life. The pure, unguarded, uncontained quality of it, real joy with nothing held in reserve. He stood up from the buckboard seat and helped her in and climbed back beside her, and they rode the first mile in silence, and then he said quietly, I thought I was building this place for myself. I did not understand until recently that I was actually building it for something I had not been able to imagine yet. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means I did not know what I was hoping for until it arrived on the afternoon train wearing the wrong name, he said, and glanced at her with that near smile that she had long since understood was his equivalent of a full open grin. She laughed. She put her hand on his arm and laughed, and it felt like the desert in spring, sudden and genuine, the cold giving way all at once. The summer of 1883 was hot, as it always was, but Opal had acclimatized now, and the heat felt like a native thing, like something she had adapted to rather than something being done to her. She managed the ranch accounts and the garden and the correspondence and the ongoing record of the water agreement, and Margaret Beauchamp came twice a week, and they sat on the porch and mended and talked, and Opal felt, in those hours, a kind of uncomplicated contentment that she had not known enough of in her life. Clara wrote again in July with wonderful news. The schoolteacher Henry had made his intentions formal, and they were to be married in September, and Clara was happy, genuinely happy, and she hoped Opal was well, and she wanted, if Opal was willing, to come visit New Mexico territory sometime in the following year. She had never seen it, she wrote, and she had always wondered about the place that had taken her cousin's heart so completely. Opal wrote back immediately, a long, warm letter full of specifics. The smell of the sage after rain, the way the mountains looked in the late summer heat haze, the coyotes at night, the red rock in the early morning. She described Raymond with the particular freedom of a woman who has nothing to hide, and she described the ranch and the cattle and the kitchen and the north room with its new bed and its window looking out over the desert, and she told Clara that she was welcome any time, and that she was very glad about Henry, and that poetry was perhaps more useful than either of them had previously understood. In the middle of August, Dale Hurst came to the ranch again. This time he came alone, no hands behind him, and he came on a dusty afternoon when the heat was at its worst, and Raymond was in the far pasture. Opal came out onto the porch when she heard the hoofbeats and stood there with her hands shading her eyes. Hurst looked different from the last time. The comfortable confidence had moderated into something that was, she realized, somewhat closer to honest. He dismounted and held his hat in his hands and said, "Mrs. Walden, is Raymond about?" "He will be in within the hour," she said. "Do you want to wait?" "I'll wait," he said. She brought water out. It was simply good manners in this heat, and she had no quarrel with basic decency, and he sat on the porch steps and drank it and did not speak for a while. Then he said, "I heard you are expecting." "I am," she said. He nodded. He was quiet again. Then he said, "My wife is expecting too, fourth one." He looked at the horizon. First three were girls. "Girls are fine," she said simply. "I know that." He paused. "I have been difficult about the water rights. I want you to know I know that." She considered him. "You were protecting what you thought you needed by the only method you thought was available. It was the wrong method, but I understand the impulse." He looked at her with a faint surprise. "That is more charitable than I deserve." "Probably," she said, "but I find it is usually more useful to understand a thing than to judge it." Raymond came up from the south pasture shortly after that, and the men talked on the porch for half an hour about nothing very complicated: the cattle, the coming fall weather, the price of beef in Albuquerque. At the end of it, Hurst shook Raymond's hand and nodded to Opal and got back on his horse and rode away, and Raymond watched him go and said, "What did you say to him?" "Nothing remarkable," she said. "He looked like a man who had been shown something he was not expecting." "Perhaps," she said. "I told him I understood the impulse, even if not the method." Raymond looked at her with that warm, particular attention. "You did it again," he said. "Did what?" "Made something easier than it needed to be," he said. "You have a talent for that." She felt the compliment land in the specific, real way that honest compliments land, not on the surface but somewhere deeper, somewhere that mattered. "I learned it from you," she said. "You made things easier than they needed to be from the very first evening. You asked me what I wanted to happen instead of telling me what was going to happen. I have not forgotten that." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Come inside. It is too hot to stand in the sun." She followed him in, and in the kitchen he stopped her with a hand on her arm and turned her to face him and kissed her in the particular way he had decided, without reservation. And she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat steady under her palms, and thought that all of this was real. Not borrowed, not temporary, not wearing someone else's name. This was hers, entirely and permanently hers, and the knowledge of it was so solid and so warm it was like standing in the sun. The baby arrived on a cold morning in late January, the second year of their marriage, when the north wind was pushing hard against the new wall and the kitchen fire was burning high, and Dr. Hoover was there with his sleeves rolled and his bespectacled manner of matter-of-fact competence. Margaret Beauchamp was there too, and Abilene Crane, and Raymond was in the parlor wearing a groove in the floor that Opal could hear through the wall between contractions and which made her feel, even in the difficulty of it, an inexplicable and somewhat irrational affection for him. It was a boy. He came in the gray winter dawn, already vocal about his opinions, with his father's dark hair, and as far as Opal could tell in the first hazy moments, her own eyes, that pale creekwater green looking up at her with the profound, unfocused attention of someone who had just arrived in a world he intended to examine carefully. They named him James. Raymond held him that first morning with the same quality he brought to everything deliberate, present, without any performance of the emotion but containing an enormous amount of it underneath, and Opal watched his face and thought that she had seen him happy in 100 ways over the past year and a half, but that this was a different kind of happiness, the kind that did not have a comparison to anything that came before it. He looked up from the baby to her and said, "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and very glad." "Good," he said, "both of those make sense." She laughed again. She seemed to laugh more freely these days. The laughter came from somewhere without effort, without the old guardedness that had kept her quiet in Gordon's world where nothing she said was quite right. Here everything she said was quite right, or at least it was hers, which was the same thing. Clara and Henry came to visit in the spring, as promised. Clara arrived on the same afternoon train, from the same station, and Opal was on the platform this time, not Raymond, and the two cousins looked at each other across the steam and the noise of the platform, and then came together and held on for a moment with the particular force of people who have things to make right between them and are ready to make them right. Henry was exactly what you might expect of a schoolteacher who read poetry thin, earnest, with ink-stained fingers, and a remarkable gift for attentive listening that complemented Clara's more animated temperament beautifully. They had been married since September, and they moved together with the comfortable ease of people who had already done the hard work of becoming used to each other. Clara stood in the kitchen of the ranch house on the first evening and looked around at the iron range and the table and the ledger books and the good lamp, and James in the cradle by the window, and Raymond Walden moving through the room with that unhurried, capable solidity, and she looked at Opal with an expression that was complex and honest and said, "It suits you, all of it. Everything about it suits you." "I know," Opal said, and then gently, "Thank you, Clara, for the train ticket." Clara made a small, dismissive sound. "You did everything with it. I only declined to use it." "You gave me a door," Opal said. "I only had to decide to open it." Clara looked at Raymond, who was doing something quietly useful across the room and pretending not to listen. "And the door had the good sense to let you in." Raymond looked up at that with the near smile. "I had a great deal of assistance from good sense," he said, which was about as much sentiment as he would offer in company, and which Opal translated correctly as meaning something considerably more. That evening they all sat on the porch in the spring warmth. Opal and Raymond and Clara and Henry and James was awake and being passed between pairs of hands, and the mountains were going pink and violet in the sunset, and the desert was doing its extraordinary spring thing of being covered in wildflowers, the brief annual abundance of it. The coyotes started early. Henry heard them and looked startled, and Clara laughed at his expression, and Raymond described their territory and their habits with the patient, specific knowledge of a man who had been listening to them for years. And Opal sat beside him and watched his face as he talked. This man who was not demonstrative in public but whose every word and gesture in private was an act of caring. And she felt the familiar, deep, unqualified happiness settle around her. They had supper inside, and it went on a long time, the way good suppers do. And afterward Clara helped with the washing up and said, quietly, with the warm steam of the dishwater between them, "Are you truly happy?" "Not the kind you say to reassure people, the real kind." "The real kind," Opal said, "entirely the real kind." Clara looked at the ring on Opal's finger, the plain silver one, slightly worn now at the edges from a year and a half of use. "You built all of this in less than 2 years." "We built all of this," Opal said. "Raymond and I and Mrs. Crane and the Beauchamps and Harlan Gibbs who married us on the porch, and even Dale Hurst in his own difficult way." She thought about it. "You build things with whatever and whoever is at hand, and you build honestly, and if you are fortunate then what you build is solid." The visit lasted 10 days. When Clara and Henry left on the southbound train, Opal stood on the platform and held James against her shoulder, and felt the absence of them already, that particular bitter sweetness of parting from people you love, and knowing that the distance is manageable, that this is not a permanent separation, that the world has gotten smaller in the ways that matter. She wrote to them once a month after that, and they wrote back, and the letters between Missouri and New Mexico carried the ongoing lives of people who were, despite everything, family. In the summer of 1884, Opal began teaching a reading class on Thursday mornings. It had started with 2 things happening at once: Margaret Beauchamp mentioning that there were several families in the Eastern Range who had children not close enough to the schoolhouse in town, and Opal finding herself restless in the particular way of someone whose capabilities are not fully occupied. She went to Raymond one evening and described the idea and said, "I would want to use the north room. The light in there is good." He had thought about it for about 30 seconds. "What do you need?" "Slates and chalk to start, a proper primer, some patience because children learning to read are not quiet. The slates and chalk I can get from Gibbs. Primer from the school teacher. What is his name? Alcott's boy, Mr. Preston," she said. "From Preston, the patience you already have." He looked at her. "How many children?" "I'm thinking 6 to begin. The Ray's family has 3 who are the right age. The Beauchamps have 2 younger ones who have been falling behind. And the Vargas family at the south end of the creek have a girl and 2 boys who have not been getting to town with any regularity." He nodded. "Good," he said. "That is a good thing to do." Yes. She ran the Thursday class through the rest of that summer and into the fall, and what happened in that north room, the room with the new wall and the good light, and the cradle in the corner where James napped through the morning lessons, was something she had not fully anticipated. She had thought she would be teaching children to read. She found she was doing something more than that. She was giving 9 children in a very isolated territory the specific, irreplaceable power of being able to connect with the larger world through letters and books, and the words on the labels of things they used every day. She watched the understanding arrive on small faces and felt, each time, the same deep satisfaction she had felt when she picked up Raymond's telegram and decided to open a door. The Ray's family sent word to her through their eldest daughter, Alina, that they were grateful in a way they did not know how to put into English, and she had said, through Alina, that no translation was necessary. She could see the gratitude clearly, and it was enough. Dale Hurst's 4th child was a boy, which Hurst announced at the general store with the unself-conscious relief of a man who had wanted a son and was not skilled at hiding it. Opal heard about it from Abilene and sent over a jar of preserves and a brief, warm note, and received in return a gruff, brief acknowledgment that was, for Hurst, the approximate equivalent of a heartfelt speech. The water agreement was renewed for the second year without incident or renegotiation. Hearst came to do it himself in person at the ranch, and he sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee and said, "You run a tight operation here, Raymond." And Raymond said, "We run it," with a slight emphasis that Hearst absorbed without comment, and the papers were signed, and the handshake given, and Opal brought out a plate of biscuits, and they ate them in a silence that was almost companionable. She sent another letter to Clara that fall with a description of the reading class and the Ray's children and Alina's particular gift for language. And Clara wrote back with a warmth that had taken on a new quality since Henry Fuller, somehow, more settled. Clara was expecting. She mentioned at the end of her letter, almost as a postscript, as though she was still deciding how much room to give it. Due in February. She was, she said, nervous and glad in equal measure. Opal wrote back immediately and at length and told her that nervous and glad in equal measure was exactly right, and that it did not stop being both of those things, and that the glad part kept growing. James was walking now and had strong opinions about the horses, which he expressed by making his way toward them at every opportunity with a purposefulness that was recognizably his father's. Raymond spent Sunday mornings taking him on tour of the barn that were ostensibly about farm education, and actually, Opal understood, about the particular pleasure of a man showing his son the specific shape of the world he had built. She watched them sometimes from the kitchen window, Raymond's dark head bent down toward the small dark head beside him, James reaching up to grip his father's hand with both of his, and thought that this was the thing she had not been able to articulate when she picked up Clara's telegram in that kitchen in Hannibal. She had not been able to say, "I want to build something real." She had only been able to feel the absence of it, the cold and hollow place where something should have been. She had not known what it would look like when she got there, but it looked like this. In November of 1884, Raymond came in from the eastern pasture with a look on his face that she had learned meant news he had not finished processing. She waited while he washed his hands and poured his coffee, and then he sat down and said, "I have had a conversation today that I want to talk through with you." "All right," she said. "Tom Beauchamp wants to expand the operation jointly," he said. "He is talking about leasing the grazing range east of the creek for 3 years and running our herds together on a shared profit basis. It would mean a larger operation, significantly larger, and it would mean more work in the accounting and more negotiation with the buyers in Albuquerque." He looked at her. She knew he was not asking for permission. That was not their way. He was asking for her honest assessment, the same way he had asked for her input on the Hearst letter 2 years ago, the same way they did everything, together with both of their intelligences in the room. "What does the lease cost?" she said. He told her. She thought about it. "And the projected increase in head per year over the 3 years. He told her that too. She got up and went to the shelf where she kept the ledger books and brought back the accounts for the past 2 years and opened them on the table between them. And they sat with their heads together over the numbers and worked it through. And at the end of an hour she said, "It is a good proposition if the lease rate does not change in year 2, and if the beef prices hold above their 1883 levels. What is Beauchamp's contingency if one of those conditions fails? He has not proposed one." "Then he needs to," she said. "Before you commit to anything, the proposition itself is sound. The failure planning is where the work needs to happen." Raymond looked at the numbers and then at her. "I will talk to him this week. Tom is not a man who minds being asked hard questions," she said. "In fact, I suspect Margaret has asked him every one of these questions already and has told him to go back and think about contingencies before he brings the proposal to you." Raymond almost smiled. "You and Margaret Beauchamp are a formidable combination." "We know that," she said. "We have always known that." The joint proposition between Raymond Walden and Tom Beauchamp was formally agreed in December of 1884, with the contingency provisions drafted at the kitchen table by Opal and presented through Raymond in a form that was careful and specific, and left nothing to goodwill that could be left to documentation instead. Tom Beauchamp shook Raymond's hand and said, "Tell your wife I said thank you for the homework," and Raymond conveyed this message, and Opal said, "Tell Tom his wife said something very similar about him." Raymond raised an eyebrow at that. "Margaret told me last Thursday," Opal said. "She was very proud." He shook his head slowly, in the manner of a man who has understood something about the structure of his social world that he perhaps should have grasped earlier. Christmas was the first one with the joint operation papers signed and the joint cattle venture technically underway, and they celebrated quietly. Raymond, Opal, James, Abilene and her husband Frank, Tom and Margaret Beauchamp with their children, and the Ray's family, who had become, over the course of the reading class, something very close to friends. Elena Reyes was 11 years old now and reading at a level that consistently astonished Opal, and she had begun corresponding with the county library in Albuquerque and receiving books by post, and the look on her face when a package arrived was something Opal considered one of the finest things she had witnessed in New Mexico territory. The new year came in cold and clear. James was almost 2, compact and determined, with his father's coloring and his mother's expression, which Raymond described once as the face of someone who has already decided what is going to happen and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Opal had objected to this description on the grounds that it was unflattering, and Raymond had said, "I meant it as a compliment," and she had said, "Then say so," and he had said in that plain, direct way that she had loved from the beginning, "You are the most purposeful person I have ever known. I mean that entirely as a compliment, and I should have said so more clearly." And she had held that for a while and then said, "Thank you, that is a good thing to be." Clara's son was born in February, on a cold Missouri morning, and the letter about it arrived in March, a happy letter, expansive and warm in the way that Clara had become, describing the baby's face and Henry's expression when he first held him, and the small apartment above the schoolhouse where they lived, already too small and perfectly beloved. She wrote that she thought about Opal often, and that she was grateful, in a way she had not initially expected to be, for the strange convergence of events that had led them both to where they were. "I gave you a borrowed name," she wrote, "and you used it to find your own life, and it turned out that what I gave up was the very thing I was never meant to have, and you took it and made it entirely yours. That seems right to me. It seems like the way things are supposed to work when they work out." Opal read this letter 3 times. Then she set it down and picked up James, who was making the circuit of the kitchen furniture with his usual territorial determination, and held him and looked out the kitchen window at the spring desert coming alive again, the green pushing up through the red earth, the mountains still white-capped and enormous against the sky. Raymond came in from the yard and saw her standing there with James, and he stopped in the doorway with the warm afternoon light behind him and looked at her for a moment with that full, unguarded happiness that she had come to know as specifically and entirely hers. He crossed the room and stood beside her, and she leaned into him slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there together looking out at the land. "Clara's baby arrived," she said. "Good news. Very good news." She paused. "Raymond." "Yes." "I want James to have a sibling." He was quiet for a moment. "I had been thinking the same thing," he said. When you are ready," he said. "There is no particular hurry." "I think I am ready," she said. "I think I have been ready for a while." She looked up at him. "I also think this ranch is going to need every capable person it can produce." He made the low sound that was his laughter. "Is that the primary consideration?" "One of them," she admitted. "The primary one is that I want more of this, more of all of it." She gestured at the window, at the land, at the room, at James, at him. "I want more life in this house." He held her more firmly and pressed a brief, warm kiss against her temple. "Then we will fill it," he said simply, and she believed him completely. The second child, a girl they named Frances after Raymond's mother, arrived in the spring of 1886, when the wildflowers were out, and the desert was doing its extravagant seasonal best, and James was 3 years old, and had very definite feelings about the new situation which he expressed loudly for approximately 2 weeks before deciding, in the pragmatic way of small children who have been given enough love to be generous with it, that the baby was interesting after all. Raymond held Frances in the kitchen on the morning after the birth with James on his knee simultaneously, one large hand supporting the baby with the same careful competence with which he had held the stunned kestrel years ago, and Opal sat across the table and watched this, and thought that the fullness of it was almost more than she could contain. Not the kind of full that was overwhelming, but the kind that was deeply, permanently satisfying, the sense of a life that had found its true shape. In the summer, Raymond took on 2 ranch hands, young men, brothers, from a family that had come west from Texas, and Opal ran the accounts for the expanded operation and continued the Thursday reading class which had grown to 11 children and required, she told Raymond, either a second session or a larger table, and he built a larger table himself over 3 weekends with a focused satisfaction that reminded her, as he always did, of someone who loved the physical reality of making things. Elena Reyes passed the county examination that summer with the highest marks of any student in the district, and Opal went to the ceremony in Coldwater Creek and sat in the second row and watched Elena walk up to receive her certificate and thought of her own mother and the farm in Illinois, and the things that had been lost, and the things that had been found, and the strange, crooked, ultimately generous path that life had taken through all of it. She wrote to Clara that evening and told her about Elena, and about Frances, and about the larger table, and about the joint cattle venture which had exceeded every projection in its second year. She wrote about James, who was showing signs of wanting to follow his father everywhere, and of wanting to follow his mother everywhere else, and of generally being everywhere at once with a cheerful, indiscriminate curiosity about the world. She wrote about Raymond, the particular quality of a Saturday evening when the work was done, and they sat on the porch together and watched the desert go dark and did not need to fill the quiet. And she wrote about what it felt like to live a life that was entirely, authentically, irrevocably her own. She sealed the letter and set it in the post pile and went back out to the porch where Raymond was sitting with his coffee in the last of the evening light, and she sat beside him, and he passed her the coffee cup without speaking, and she took it and drank and handed it back, and the mountains turned purple and then gray and then disappeared into the darkness, and the coyotes started, and the stars came out over the New Mexico territory one by one, and then all at once. In their extraordinary, uncountable abundance, the way they always did, the way they had been doing since long before either of them arrived and would be doing long after. "Raymond," she said. "Opal," he said. She smiled in the dark. He knew what she was doing. She was just saying their names. Saying them because they were real, because they were hers, because she had arrived here wearing a borrowed name and had been given back her own one, had been given it back by this man who had said it carefully and seriously the first time, like something he was learning the weight of, and had been saying it ever since with the accumulated warmth of everything they had built and become together. She had arrived wearing her cousin's name on a telegram. He had married her true name before the week was out. And in the 2.5 years since that September afternoon on the platform of the Coldwater Creek station, in all the kitchens and pastures and porch evenings and difficult negotiations and laughing and building, and the 2 small people asleep in the house behind them who contained the ongoing future of everything they were, she had become, in the fullest and most irreversible way possible, Opal Beckett Walden, wholly herself, wholly known, wholly home. The desert breathed its cool night breath around them, and the coyotes sang, and the stars burned on overhead, and Raymond reached over and took her hand on the porch railing, and she held on, and they stayed there a long time in the good, earned, permanent quiet of people who have found each other and know what they have found, and are not letting go.